Hi everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to sew my Anastasia inspired dress. I made this dress as my first cosplay quite a while ago, so I thought the instructions could use an update and a video to go along with them. Although I made this video, I do recommend reading the instructions and to ask me any questions should you have them. I will be making this dress a bit differently from the first one, but both versions are explained. If not here, then in the written instructions. There will be a lot of fast forwarding throughout this video, otherwise it would be way too long, but I hope everything is clear. I start by cutting out the pattern pieces. You'll notice that pattern piece E says corset insert in this video. However, we're not dealing with a corset exactly. You may have noticed it already, but I am not a native English speaker, and when I made this pattern, I didn't know the proper name of the piece yet. You may notice me saying something's wrong, so please feel free to correct me in the comments. Know that I will always do my best to make things as clear as possible, and that you can always let me know if anything is unclear or if you need extra help. For those of you who find my accent a bit hard to listen to, this video will have captions available. Back to the corset insert. This dress is not made with a corset but with a bodice, although I will be using ridgeline boning for some added structure. Pattern piece E is now named the Modesty panel on the pattern sheet since that's what it should be named. I drafted this pattern in a way that the bodice does not close completely, because I prefer there being a gap at the back. The Modesty panel is also completely optional. If you prefer for your skin to show, you don't have to add it. And for those who do not want a gap in the back, you can just double the back piece D in order for your bodice to close completely. This is explained further in the written instructions. Back to the cutting. You may have noticed that the pattern sheet says seam allowance not included. This is to allow for personalization. After all, this is a pattern with standard measurements, and most of us don't have standard measurements. Almost none of my patterns include seam allowances, except more universal things, so you can easily alter every aspect of the pattern. Again, you can always ask me to draft a pattern with seam allowances for you. I'm using the same light yellow or champagne colored satin fabric that I used for my first dress as the outer fabric, but this time I'm using a deeper yellow colored fabric for the lining. When it comes to seam allowance, I don't tend to add it to my paper pieces, since I might reuse a pattern and change some things, making the seam allowance change as well. To cut my seam allowance, I use these really handy seam allowance magnets. If there's something I need to pay attention to, like seam allowances for zippers, I mark or cut those first so I don't forget. In this case, the back piece D needs 4 cm or 1.5 inches of extra seam allowance for the eyelets. I have also added some extra markings to the new pattern sheet, making it more obvious where to add extra seam allowance. To make sure I do not forget to add the extra seam allowance, I mark the 4 cm or 1.5 inches directly on my fabric and cut it out. I am also adding extra seam allowance to the side seam, since I will be inserting a zipper. The zipper is of course completely optional, but I find it really useful that once I have laced up the dress, I can get in and out of it without having to undo the laces. For this dress, the most important things not to forget is to cut the front on the fabric fold, add some extra seam allowance to the side seam if you want to add a zipper, and to add extra seam allowance to the back piece for the eyelets. You'll have to do exactly the same for the lining pieces. If you're marking things on your fabric, make sure to do so in a way that it cannot be seen afterwards. I'm using a pen that erases itself with heat. This means I can do what I want with the pieces, but I have to be careful when ironing, since the heat will make all the markings completely disappear. Make sure to mark the top of all the pieces, especially the back piece. You don't want to attach it upside down. While I'm using the same color outer fabric, the fabric weight is much lighter than the fabric I used before, so I decided to double it with sturdy tulle. This is completely optional. I initially wanted to double the fabric with iron-on batiste, but I have had some bad experience with satin fabric coming loose and forming bubbles. I didn't want that, so I went with the tulle. Again, if your fabric has enough weight to it, you don't have to double it. You might have noticed that this pattern only comes with the pieces for the bodice. This is because you can customize this dress by making it with a rectangle skirt or a circle skirt, whichever you prefer. I do include instructions on how to draft the different kinds of skirt patterns in the written instructions. For those of you who do not want to draft your own skirt pattern, you can of course always ask me to draft it for you. I started basting the tulle to the satin with my sewing machine, but I didn't like the result of that, so I switched to hand basting the tulle and the satin together. This took some time, but the result was way neater, and the hand basting stitches are much easier to remove. Once I basted all the tulle and satin pieces together, I start constructing the bodice. I pin all the pieces right sides together, but I won't sew the left side seam, since this is the seam in which I will be inserting my zipper. I also pin the shoulder seams. If you are not inserting a zipper, you can just sew the second side seam closed as well. I do the same for my lining pieces. I'm using a Teflon presser foot to glide over the fabric more easily and take out the pins as I go. After sewing all the pieces together, I go straight to my serger and serge all the seams I've just sewn, as well as the top edge, armhole openings and bodice hem. If you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch to finish your edges and stop your fabric from fraying. I will be inserting ridgeline boning into the lining of the bodice, and I will be using the seams we just made as boning channels. So although I serge the bottom of the seams closed, I will be opening them later to insert the bones. I'm making sure to direct the seams towards the side I want them to go for my boning channels. As I said before, I will only be inserting boning into the lining, but I will stitch the seams of the outer layer towards the same side as the boning channels to create the illusion that they are inserted into the outer layer as well. I'm sewing both the front princess seams and the back seams towards the sides. Since I will be inserting a zipper into the left side seam, I'm sewing the right side seam so it lays open. I again do the same for the lining pieces. Once I'm done serging, I start to remove almost all basting stitches. For now, I'm leaving the basting stitch in the left side seam and in the center back pieces. Next, I take my main fabric pieces and fold over the 4 cm or 1.5 inch seam allowance on both of the center back pieces and prepare to sew a decorative stitching line at about 1.5 cm or 0.6 inches from the edge. I also pin in my zipper. I sew the decorative stitching line on the center back pieces and switch my presser foot to a blind zipper foot to sew in the zipper. While I have my sewing machine out, I switch back to the Teflon presser foot and sew the decorative stitching for the 4 boning channels of the outer layer. I move the left front princess seam towards the side left and stitch a decorative line at bone width. I do the same for the right princess seam, but towards the side right. I repeat the process for the back seams, sewing the left back seam towards the side left and the right back seam towards the side right. Once that's done, I again use my pen with disappearing ink and mark where I want my eyelets to be. The pattern has the eyelets marked on it, but these markings are just for reference. You can install the eyelets at your preferred distance. I decided to add an extra eyelet. I take my eyelet punch and setter, cut the holes and install the eyelets. You don't need to have an eyelet punch to do this, but if you have one, it makes the process a lot easier and faster. I use a piece of cardboard underneath my fabric to make the hole punching a bit easier on the machine. Once I have set all the eyelets on one side, I transfer the placement onto the other side and repeat the process. You might notice me pushing down multiple times in the same spot. This is not because my machine doesn't cut the holes at once. I'm just making sure the holes are made in the exact spot I want them to be, because once the hole is made, there's no turning back. Now I go back to my sewing machine and sew the boning channels into the lining. Since I already serged my seams towards the correct side, this process is simple and fast. You can of course use bone casing tape or ribbon as your boning channel, but since this is a costume and I'm only using rigid boning, I'm using the seams of the lining fabric. Make sure to stitch your boning channels just wide enough. My boning is 8mm or 0.3 inches wide, so my boning channel is about 9mm or 0.35 inches wide. Like I said before, I serged the ends of my boning channels closed, so I have to reopen them to be able to insert my boning. Once I cut my boning, I'll make sure to iron it first, since rigid boning can shrink with heat. By ironing it first, I'll make sure it can't shrink anymore while also flattening it. I cover the ends of the rigid boning and slide them into the boning channels. I'm using plumber's tape for this, but you can use any kind of tape, or even special end caps for boning, but in that case your boning channels will have to be wider, and since the fabric is so light, the thinner the binding on the ends, the better. Next, I start putting together my Modesty panel. I take both my doubled satin piece and my lining piece and place them right sides together. I pin the edges, making sure to leave one of the long edges open. I sew and serge all the other edges and clip the two outer corners. I turn the piece inside out, making sure the corners are nice and sharp, and serge the open edge. This serged edge will be hidden later. Once that's done, I move on to the sleeves. I fold my organza fabric in a way that I have 4 layers and 2 fabric folds, and cut out my sleeves. I added extra seam allowance to the sleeve hem, although you will see later that I decided to hem them in a way that this wasn't necessary. I outlined the sleeves with my heat erasable pen. At this point my camera cut out, but all I did was mark all around the sleeves and place a mark at about 10 cm or 4 inches from the top of one of the sleeves. Since I have inserted a zipper, the sleeve has to open a bit in order not to rip when opening the zipper. The sleeve with this mark will be the left sleeve. If you are not inserting a zipper, you can skip this mark. For the skirt, if you are not making a rectangle skirt, I recommend using at least your hip circumference as a top radius. This will ensure you are able to get into the dress without having to add a zipper to the skirt part. I usually cut circle skirts directly out of the fabric, but since these fabrics are so light and slippery, I decided to draft a pattern for it. I didn't have as much of the yellow satin as I thought, so I ended up choosing a top radius that was just enough for the skirt to be pulled on over my head. Ideally, this is a bit more. In hindsight, I could have made the circumference a bit wider, but I didn't want to end up not having enough fabric for the skirt. When the dress was done, I decided to get more fabric and to add another panel of satin and organza fabric to the skirt, making the top radius bigger. I cut the main skirt in 3 pieces. One part cut on the fabric fold for the front, and the other half of the skirt cut into 2 pieces for the back. So this skirt has 3 seams, 2 side seams and 1 center back seam. I cut the organza overlay in 2 pieces, so that this skirt only has 2 side seams. I also made the organza overlay a little bit longer than the yellow satin skirt. I went back to my serger and decided whether I wanted to use a regular stitch or the narrow/rolled hem stitch. I decided to go with the narrow stitch for the sleeves and the regular stitch for the skirt. For the sleeves and the skirts, I'm using a French seam. I start by serging the long edges of the sleeve together with the narrow stitch. Since I'm using a French seam, I'm doing this with the wrong sides together. But the organza doesn't have a wrong side, so for this fabric it doesn't really matter. Once the 2 edges of the sleeve are serged together, I turn the sleeve inside out and pin along the seam allowance, closing in the serged seam. I will be sewing this seam later. I do the same for the other sleeve. I do the same for my skirts, but using the regular stitch. With the satin skirt, there is a right and a wrong side to the fabric, so make sure to serge the layers with the wrong sides together. If you are not making French seams, you can just go ahead and serge and sew as you normally would, with the right sides together. I move everything back to the sewing machine and sew all the side seams with the right sides together, completing the French seam. After finishing all the French seams, I go on to hem the sleeves and skirts. For this, I decide to use my narrow rolled hem presser foot. This is again completely optional, but it gives everything a nice finish, although using the presser foot can be a bit fiddly at first. Since I decided to use this presser foot, I did not serge the hems. Serging would add too much bulk and the results of using this presser foot wouldn't be as nice. I used the same presser foot for my sleeves, so I didn't really need the extra seam allowance, but even so I didn't cut it off. I didn't mind the extra length, and the pen line serves as a good example to see how it later disappears when ironing. If you don't have this presser foot, you can finish the hems whichever way you like best. Once everything is hemmed, I go back to the top of the sleeve and place a pin in the fold marks. I fold each pin towards the next one, creating the folds that shape the head of the sleeve. The new sleeve pattern has an extra fold mark, so you have 5 folds on each side. Once I have the folds pinned down, I go back to my serger and serge them in place. Again, if you do not have a serger, you can just baste them in place. I also take this opportunity to serge both my skirt layers together. Since I added an extra panel later on, I removed these stitches, added the panels, serged both layers together again, and stitched 2 lines with elastic bobbin thread, which I recommend doing, resulting in more even gathers when reattaching the skirt to the bodice. Once I have serged the folds into place, I pin the sleeves into the satin bodice, after which I sew them in place. After doing this, I place my lining pieces on top of my satin pieces, right sides together, and pin the top edge. I move all this to the sewing machine and sew said edge. I clip the inner corners at the front and back shoulder seams and understitch the seam allowance to the lining. Doing this will make sure the satin pieces fold over the lining pieces better, preventing the lining pieces from peeking out at the top. I also edge stitch along the edges of the Modesty panel. At this point, I pin the lining to the zipper, but I will only be finishing this later, so you don't have to do this yet, since we have to move the lining out of the way for the next step. I fold over the extra seam allowance from the center back lining pieces and pin it in place. I then take my Modesty panel and line up the serged edge of the Modesty panel with the folded over seam allowance. I am attaching my Modesty panel to the left side, but you can attach it to the right side if wanted. I then align the satin center back piece with the eyelets with the lining center back and Modesty panel and pin it in place. I do the same for the other side, but without the Modesty panel in between the layers. Now you can see why we also had to add the extra seam allowance to the lining pieces. The folded over seam allowance protects the skin from the eyelets. So even if you don't have a Modesty panel, your skin never comes in contact with the eyelets. I go back to the sewing machine and sew over the same decorative stitch we made earlier. By sewing over the same line, you are attaching the outer layer and lining layer and the optional Modesty panel, while leaving enough room to comfortably lace up the back. Once that's done, I top stitch along the top of the bodice and along the inside of the armholes, stitching the sleeve top seam to the bodice. Make sure that your lining stays free. We will finish this by hand later. To finish the armholes, I fold over the lining seam allowance and pin it in place. You can sew this edge by machine, but I find the finish way neater by hand. I will attach the lining by hand later. We're almost done. I take my bodice and skirt and pin the skirt to the satin part of the bodice, pinning the lining out of the way. You will end up with a gap in the back, but this is completely okay and even necessary. Thanks to this gap, which will be covered by the bow, you will be able to tighten or loosen the lacing at the back evenly, and you will be able to get in and out of your dress without having to install a zipper into the skirt. I sew all around the skirt and over the zipper. You can finish the edge of the gap if you like, but I don't, since I already serged it and it won't be visible. Now I fold over the lining hem and pin it over the seam we just stitched. This is the moment where I sew all the lining edges by hand. So there are those for the zipper, the armholes and the lining hem. This step takes a while, but it gives you a really nice finish. Once I've done that, I iron the dress to remove all the pen marks. After you're done with the hand sewing, all that's left to do is lace up the bodice and add your sash and bow. And that's it. This will always be one of my favorite dresses, so I hope you get just as much enjoyment out of it as me. My original dress has been damaged a bit over the years, mostly the sash and bow, but I'm still very fond of it. I prefer the skirt of this version. I love the flowiness and the golden organza overlay instead of the very light yellow. On the other hand, I prefer the light yellow organza for the sleeves, so I might just attach a new skirt to the old bodice. I hope you found this video useful, and I hope to have the next tutorial ready for you soon. Bye!